The sprawling beast of Mexico City breathes in exhaust and breathes out chaos. It is a monster of 20 million souls, a labyrinth of concrete and noise where it is perilously easy to disappear. In the late 1990s and bleeding into the early years of the new millennium, a different kind of darkness began to pool in the corners of this metropolis, specifically within the quiet, dusty apartments of the elderly. This wasn't the cartel violence that splashed across the evening news in bright crimson. This was something quieter, something intimate, something that knocked on the door with a smile and left with a soul. The city was busy, always moving, always shouting, but behind the closed doors of the boroughs like Venustiano Carranza, a predator was hunting the most invisible members of society, the abuelitas, the grandmothers. These were women who had lived their lives, raised their families, and were now existing in the twilight of their years, often alone, often forgotten by a world that worshipped youth. They were the perfect victims because their silence was already deafening before the killer ever arrived. It started slowly, a whisper in the back alleys of police precincts. Bodies were being found, not shot, not stabbed in a frenzy of passion, but extinguished like candles in a drafty room. The official reports were dry, bureaucratic text, but the scenes they described were nightmares frozen in time. Elderly women, 60, 70, 80 years old, found dead in their own living rooms. There was no forced entry, no shattered windows or kicked-in doors. The monster had been invited in. The killer didn't bring a weapon. That was the detail that made the hair on the back of the detective's neck stand up. The weapon was the home itself. A pair of pantyhose drying on a rack, the cord of a telephone that had rung unanswered, the curtain sash that once held back the morning light. These became the tools of the Matavillagitas, the little old lady killer. It was a nickname that sounded almost folkloric, like a boogeyman to scare children, but the reality was visceral and terrifying. By 2003, the trickle of cases had swollen into a stream that the authorities could no longer ignore, though they tried desperately to rationalize it away. Media sensationalism. The police chiefs grumbled initially, waving away the connections. They didn't want a serial killer. Mexico City didn't have serial killers. That was a gringo problem, an American madness. But the bodies kept stacking up, and the pattern was undeniable. Each crime scene whispered the same story: trust betrayed. The victims were often found with 2 cups of coffee on the table, or a glass of water half drunk. They had sat with their killer. They had conversed. They had looked into the eyes of the person who would end their lives and seen not a monster, but a friend, a social worker, a nurse. The killer wore a mask of benevolence, a camouflage of care that allowed them to walk past neighbors and doormen without raising a single eyebrow. Panic began to curdle the air of the city. Grandmothers stopped opening their doors. Sons and daughters called home with frantic warnings. Don't open the door for anyone, Mama. Not for the government. Not for charity. Not for anyone. But the killer was a chameleon. The killer knew exactly what to say to unlock the heavy deadbolts of fear. The police were chasing a phantom. Their psychological profile was confident, definitive, and dead wrong. They told the public they were looking for a man. A male, likely a transvestite, the profilers declared. They reasoned that the strength required to strangle a human being with a telephone cord, the sheer physical power needed to subdue these women, had to come from a man. They harassed the trans community, raiding safe havens, rounding up innocent people, desperate to pin the Matavillagitas label on a deviant male. They couldn't conceive, not in their wildest machismo-fueled dreams, that the strength crushing the life out of Mexico's matriarchs belonged to a woman. They were looking for a wolf, never suspecting that the wolf was wearing the skin of a sheep, walking among them in a skirt, blending into the crowd, invisible and deadly. The shadow over the city grew longer, and the little old lady killer laughed in the silence, preparing for the next knock on the door. To understand the monster that stalked the concrete jungle of Mexico City, we must leave the bustling streets and travel back in time, back to the dusty, sun-baked earth of Hidalgo in the late 1950s. We must look into the eyes of a child named Juana, a little girl who learned early that the hands meant to hold you are often the ones that hurt you the most. Monsters, you see, are rarely born. They are forged, hammered into shape by cruelty and neglect, and Juana Barraza was forged in the hottest fires of hell. Her life began in 1957, but it wasn't a beginning marked by hope. Her father, a married man who had an affair with her mother, abandoned them, leaving Juana alone with a woman named Justice Sampirio. If there is a villain in this story before the villain we know emerges, it is Justa. She was a woman consumed by her own demons, a severe alcoholic whose love for the bottle far eclipsed any maternal instinct she might have possessed. To the outside world, she was a struggling single mother. To Juana, she was a tyrant, a chaotic storm of rage and neglect. The home was not a sanctuary. It was a prison of fear. Little Juana didn't learn nursery rhymes. She learned the sound of staggering footsteps, the smell of cheap, sour pulque on her mother's breath, and the sting of a hand striking flesh. She was forbidden from going to school, forbidden from learning to read or write. While other children were learning their alphabet, Juana was learning how to make herself small, how to disappear into the corners of a room to avoid the unpredictable wrath of the woman who gave her life. But the abuse wasn't just physical, it was a systematic dismantling of her soul. Justice Sampirio didn't just neglect her daughter. She seemingly despised her existence. She looked at Juana and saw a burden, a mouth to feed that took money away from her next drink. And it was this unquenchable thirst for alcohol that led to the moment that would shatter Juana's psyche forever. The moment that the little old lady killer began to germinate in the darkness of a child's heart. It happened when Juana was just a young girl, barely entering her teens. The desperation for a drink had clawed at Justa's mind, erasing all boundaries of morality. She needed money, or she needed a trade, and she had nothing of value, nothing but her daughter. In an act of betrayal so profound it defies comprehension, Justice Sampirio looked at a man, a stranger, a predator looking for a victim, and she struck a deal. She didn't sell her daughter for a fortune. She didn't sell her for a house or a car. She sold her own flesh and blood for 3 beers. 3 beers. That was the price tag placed on Juana's innocence. Justa took the alcohol, turned her back, and locked the door, leaving her daughter alone in a room with a man who would ravage her. The betrayal was absolute. As Juana endured the horror of repeated sexual assaults by this man, with her mother's tacit approval bought for a few pesos worth of liquor, something inside her broke. But it didn't just break, it calcified. She became pregnant from these assaults, a child having a child, trapped in a cycle of misery. But the true legacy of that day wasn't just the trauma, it was the hatred. A specific, boiling, volcanic hatred directed not just at men, but at her mother, at the figure of the mother, at older women. Justice Sampirio became the archetype of evil in Juana's mind. Every time she looked at an elderly woman, she didn't see a sweet grandmother. She saw Justa. She saw the woman who traded her for a drink. She saw the woman who laughed while she cried. Years later, when Juana's hands would wrap around the throat of a defenseless octogenarian in Mexico City, she wasn't just killing a stranger. In her twisted, fractured reality, she was killing Justice Samperio over and over and over again. She was punishing the mother who failed her, the little old lady who should have protected her but instead threw her to the wolves. The 3 beers had been drunk long ago, but the hangover would last a lifetime, and it would be paid for in blood. She grew not like a flower, but like a twisted oak, gnarled, tough, and formidable. The malnourished girl who had been traded for alcohol vanished, replaced by a woman of imposing physical stature. Juana Barraza was not built for the invisible, domestic life that Mexican society prescribed for women. She was broad-shouldered, possessing a raw, dense strength that simmered beneath her skin. She carried the rage of her childhood like a loaded weapon, looking for a target, looking for a release, and she found it in the unlikeliest of cathedrals, the raucous, sweat-soaked arenas of lucha libre. Lucha libre in Mexico is not merely a sport. It is a religion of masks and mythology, a theater of good versus evil played out on a canvas mat. For Juana, it was a revelation. Here was a place where violence was not only permitted but celebrated. Here, a woman could be a warrior. She entered this world not as a spectator, but as a combatant. She trained hard, her body absorbing the slams and the strikes, her muscles hardening into armor. She learned the art of the grapple, the mechanics of the hold, and the precise, terrifying efficiency of the choke. She crafted a persona, a second skin to hide the scars of the first. She became La Dama del Silencio, the Lady of Silence. The name itself was a chilling prophecy, a subconscious whisper of the destiny she was carving out for herself. She didn't choose a name that screamed chaos or noise. She chose silence. The silence of the grave. The silence she would later impose upon the screaming, terrified women in their final moments. In the ring, La Dama del Silencio was a force. She wore a suit that was often pink or white, colors of innocence that belied the brutality of her trade, and a mask, always the mask. The mask is the soul of the luchador. It allows them to become someone else, to shed their mortal worries and become a god. Behind the mask, Juana felt powerful. When she stepped through the ropes, the crowd roared. They saw a strong, capable woman, a ruda, who broke the rules and dominated her opponents. For 15 minutes a night, she wasn't the abused daughter of an alcoholic. She was a queen of the ring, commanding respect through sheer physical dominance. But the tragedy of the luchador is that the mask must eventually come off. The lights of the arena would dim, the cheering crowds would disperse into the night, and La Dama del Silencio would cease to exist. In her place stood Juana Barraza, a struggling single mother living on the margins of society. The glory of the ring did not pay the bills. The applause did not put food on the table. The reality was a crushing, humiliating contrast to the fantasy. By day, the queen of the ring was often reduced to selling popcorn and trinkets outside the very arenas where she wrestled. She would stand with a tray of snacks, invisible to the fans who had just cheered for her alter ego. She scrubbed floors. She took odd jobs. She washed the clothes of others. The disconnect was maddening. She possessed the strength to crush a person's windpipe, yet she was powerless against the grinding poverty that suffocated her family. This duality began to fracture her mind even further. There was the Juana who was a hero, a strong, silent warrior. And there was the Juana who was nothing, a nobody scraping for pesos. And simmering constantly beneath both identities was the memory of the 3 beers. The resentment toward the elderly did not fade, it festered, as she learned to apply pressure to a neck in the ring. Feeling the pulse of her opponent flutter under her thumb, she was unknowingly rehearsing. She was perfecting the grip that would soon turn her into the most feared woman in Mexico's history. The Lady of Silence was getting ready to bring the silence home, to take the violence off the canvas and into the living rooms of those who reminded her of the mother she hated. The wrestler was about to tag out, and the killer was preparing to enter the ring. The rope of Juana's sanity had been fraying for decades, worn thin by the friction of abuse, poverty, and the relentless, grinding duality of her existence. But it was still holding. She was a mother, and despite her own horrific upbringing, she loved her children with a fierce, protective intensity. They were the anchor that kept her tethered to humanity. She had 4 children, and her eldest son was her pride, her hope for a future that wasn't stained with the sins of her past. But in the violent ecosystem of Mexico City, hope is a fragile thing, easily shattered by a stray bullet or a meaningless brawl. The year was 1995. The precise details of the tragedy are often swallowed by the chaos of the streets, but the outcome was absolute. Her eldest son, a young man with his whole life ahead of him, was murdered. He wasn't taken by a disease or an accident. He was taken by the senseless violence of the city, killed in a mugging or a street dispute, a life extinguished for nothing. When the news reached Juana, the world didn't just stop, it inverted. The grief was not a wave. It was a tsunami that drowned the last remnants of the normal woman she was trying to be. A mother's grief is a potent force, capable of destroying her or redefining her. For Juana, it was the final blow to the structural integrity of her soul. The scream that tore from her throat wasn't just for her son. It was a howl at the universe, at God, at the cruel injustice of a life that had taken everything from her, her innocence, her dignity, and now her flesh and blood. The breaking point had arrived. The anchor was gone, and Juana Barraza was now adrift in a sea of black rage. But the human mind is a complex, twisted machine. It seeks patterns, it seeks targets. Juana could not find the people who killed her son. She could not punish the random chaos of the universe. So, her broken psyche went looking for a scapegoat, a vessel into which she could pour all her venom. And her mind snapped back to the root of all her pain. It didn't go to the men who killed her son. It went to her, to Justice Samperio, to the mother who had sold her, to the archetype of the old lady. In Juana's shattered logic, the world was cruel because she had been raised in cruelty. The failure of protection started with her mother. The rage she felt for her son's death merged with the ancient, festering hatred for her mother, creating a new, monstrous compulsion. She began to wander the streets, not as a wrestler, not as a vendor, but as a predator testing the wind. The year 1998 marked the turning of the page. The transition was complete. She looked at the elderly women of Mexico City, the viejitas shuffling to the market, the grandmothers watering their plants, and she didn't see victims. She saw culprits. She saw women who had lived long lives while her son was dead. She saw women who were likely bad mothers, just like Justa. She saw vulnerability that disgusted her. The first kill is often described by serial killers as a moment of terrified ecstasy, a release of pressure so intense it feels sexual, spiritual. We do not know the exact name of the very first victim, for the little old lady killer operated in the shadows for years before the pattern was recognized, but the method was born in this period of darkness. She realized that her strength, the wrestler's power she had honed in the ring, was sufficient. She didn't need a gun. She didn't need a knife. She needed her hands. She found that the rage, when focused, gave her a terrifying clarity. She could walk down the street, locking eyes with an elderly woman, and smile. And the woman would smile back, seeing a sturdy, middle-aged woman, perhaps a bit rough around the edges, but safe. Safe. That was the key. Juana realized she possessed the ultimate camouflage. She wasn't a young thug in a hoodie. She wasn't a menacing man. She was a woman. She was a señora. The grief for her son had hollowed her out, leaving a void that could only be filled with control. And the ultimate control was taking a life. The wrestler La Dama del Silencio had retired from the ring, but she had found a new arena. Her opponents were no longer masked fighters. They were frail, lonely women behind deadbolt doors. And this time, there was no referee to stop the fight. The bell had rung, and the slaughter was about to begin. She became a phantom of the daylight, an entity that thrived not in the shadows of the night, but in the bustle of the afternoon sun. The brilliance of her method lay in its simplicity and its cruelty. She preyed on hope. To the lonely, forgotten elderly women of Mexico City, she did not appear as a reaper. She appeared as an angel of mercy. She crafted a disguise that was unimpeachable in the eyes of the working class, the uniform of the helper. Sometimes she wore the crisp white coat of a nurse, carrying a stethoscope that would never listen to a beating heart, only stop one. Other times, she carried a clipboard and wore the officious, weary expression of a government social worker. She was the promotora de salud, the health promoter, or the bearer of good news about pension increases or free grocery handouts from the mayor's office. She carried the heavy, authoritative weight of bureaucracy, and for the elderly poor, bureaucracy meant survival. She would walk the streets of neighborhoods like Moctezuma or Jardín Balbuena, scanning for the telltale signs. A woman walking slowly with a cane, a window with old lace curtains, a lack of movement. She hunted for solitude. When she identified a target, she approached with a practiced warmth. "Good morning, Madrecita," she would say, using the diminutive term of endearment that disarmed them instantly. "I am from the government. We are updating the pension rolls. Do you have your identification? I can help you get more money for your medicine." The door, previously bolted against the dangers of the city, would swing open. Why wouldn't it? Who fears a sturdy, middle-aged woman offering help? Who fears a nurse? Juana stepped across the threshold, and with that single step, the home transformed from a sanctuary into a tomb. Once inside, the ritual began. It was a macabre dance of intimacy. She would sit with them at their kitchen tables, amidst the smell of old paper and boiled beans. She would ask for a glass of water, a simple request that established a guest-host bond. They would chat. She would listen to their complaints about their aching joints, their ungrateful children, the rising cost of tortillas. She played the role perfectly, nodding with empathy, her large, powerful hands resting calmly on her lap. Then, the shift would occur. It was sudden, silent, and terrifying. It usually happened when the victim's back was turned, perhaps to fetch a document or refill a glass. Juana would rise, moving with the silent agility of La Dama del Silencio. The wrestler would take over. She didn't carry a knife or a gun. She despised them. She needed to feel the life leave the body. She needed the tactile confirmation of her power. She would grab whatever was at hand. A gruesome improvisation that made each crime scene unique, yet hauntingly similar. A pair of pantyhose drying on the back of a chair became a garrote. The cord of the telephone, the lifeline to the outside world, became the instrument of death. A curtain sash, a stethoscope. She would wrap it around the frail, wrinkled neck from behind. There was rarely a scream. There wasn't time. The victims, caught in the mundane safety of their own homes, were overwhelmed by the sudden, crushing violence. Juana's strength, honed in the ring against women half her age, was insurmountable for an 80-year-old. She would tighten the ligature, her face likely contorted not in a grimace of effort, but in a mask of focused, cold determination. As the women struggled, gasping for air, their eyes bulging in confusion and terror, Juana would whisper nothing. She was the lady of silence, and she was bringing them the ultimate silence. She watched the light fade from their eyes, feeling the tremors of their dying bodies against her own. In those moments, she was godlike. She was extinguishing the Justice Imperio in front of her. She was snuffing out the weakness, the neediness, the mother who had failed. When the body finally went limp, she didn't flee in a panic. She lowered them gently to the floor, sometimes even placing a pillow under their heads or arranging their limbs, a bizarre, contradictory gesture of care after the brutality of murder. She was the angel of death, and her work was done. The house was quiet again, save for the ticking of a clock that now marked the time of a corpse. She would stand over them, catching her breath, the adrenaline flooding her system, before turning her attention to the rest of the apartment. The killing was the meal. The robbery that followed was just the dessert. While the bodies of the grandmothers grew cold in their apartments, a different kind of sickness was spreading through the headquarters of the Mexico City Police. It was the sickness of incompetence, fueled by prejudice and a desperate need for a quick answer. The detectives were under immense pressure. The media had smelled blood. The headlines were screaming, El Mataviejitas, the little old lady killer, and the public was terrified. The police needed a face to put on the monster. They needed a suspect. And in their haste, they looked into the mirror of their own biases and saw a reflection that didn't exist. The forensic evidence was puzzling. The killer was strong, incredibly strong. The ligatures were pulled with a force that snapped cartilage and crushed windpipes instantly. The victims, though elderly, sometimes showed signs of having been subdued with a physical dominance that the police associated strictly with masculinity. Furthermore, there were witnesses, vague, terrified neighbors who had seen a large, broad-shouldered person fleeing the scene. Some said the person had short hair. Some said the person moved with a heavy, purposeful gait. The profilers sat in smoke-filled rooms and did the math of machismo. A woman could not do this, they concluded. A woman kills with poison, or in self-defense, or in a crime of passion. A woman does not hunt strangers. A woman does not strangle for the thrill of it. A woman does not have this kind of raw power. Therefore, the killer had to be a man. But the witnesses reported a woman's clothing, a skirt, a blouse. The deduction was swift and disastrous. The killer is a man dressing as a woman. The killer is a transvestite. With this flawed profile locked in, the police launched a witch hunt that would become a stain on the history of Mexican law enforcement. They turned their sights on the transgender and transvestite community of Mexico City, a group already marginalized and vulnerable. Operation Beauty was unofficially underway. Patrol cars swept through the red light districts and the safe havens where trans sex workers gathered. They kicked down doors not to find a murderer, but to find anyone who fit the description of a man in a dress. Innocent people were dragged into interrogation rooms, humiliated and fingerprinted. Their wigs were pulled off, their makeup scrubbed away, their dignity stripped in a desperate bid to find the monster. The police created sketches of the killer that looked grotesque, caricatures of men in bad drag, fueling public transphobia. They were looking for a pervert, a deviant, a man, mocking womanhood. Meanwhile, Juana Barraza walked right past them. She walked past the checkpoints. She walked past the patrol cars idling on the corners. She walked past the wanted posters that showed a man's face with a wig. She was invisible. She was the man in the dress they were hunting, except she wasn't a man and the dress wasn't a costume. It was just her clothes. The irony was so sharp it could cut glass. The very traits that made her a suspect in the physical sense, her broad shoulders, her wrestler's build, her short, sensible hair, were the very things protecting her because she was biologically female. The police saw a señora carrying a grocery bag and looked away. They saw a middle-aged woman waiting for the bus and saw their own aunts, their own mothers. Their misogyny blinded them. They couldn't accept that a woman could be an apex predator. They couldn't accept that the hands making tortillas could also be the hands of a serial strangler. Juana must have watched this circus with a cold, silent amusement. She saw the news reports blaming a man pretending to be a nurse. It emboldened her. It validated her. She was a ghost. The police were fighting a phantom of their own creation while she, flesh and blood and full of rage, continued her work. The dragnet tightened around the wrong throats. The trans community lived in terror, afraid to go out, afraid to work, while the real terror walked freely into the apartment complexes of the elderly. The police were so convinced of their theory that they ignored evidence that pointed elsewhere. They ignored the fact that witnesses described a masculine woman, not a man. They ignored the psychological nuance. They were chasing a he, and as long as they did, she was free to kill again. And she did. The count rose. The shadows deepened. And the man in the dress remained the most successful fiction Juana Barraza never even had to write. The silence that followed the violence was always the loudest part. With the victim lying still on the floor, the apartment would settle back into its dusty rhythm. The hum of a refrigerator, the distant bark of a dog, the murmur of traffic. In this stillness, Juana Barraza did not run. She did not panic. She began the second part of her ritual, a phase as confusing to the detectives as the murders themselves. If she were a common criminal, a desperate addict looking for a fix, she would have torn the house apart looking for cash, jewelry, or electronics. She would have stripped the rings from the dead women's fingers. But Juana was not a thief in the traditional sense. She was a collector. She moved through the rooms of the dead with a strange, discerning eye. She would bypass a television or a stereo system, items of value that could be sold easily, and instead, her hands would hover over the knickknacks, the memories, the spiritual armor of her victims. She took things that had no market value but held immense personal weight. A porcelain figurine of a dancer, a cheap print of the Virgin of Guadalupe, a crucifix hanging above the bed, a rosary made of plastic beads. These were not goods to be fenced. They were souvenirs of sin. They were trophies taken from the women she despised, little pieces of their lives that she claimed as her own. But there was a darker purpose to this looting, one rooted in the murky, syncretic spirituality that Juana practiced. She was a devout follower of Santa Muerte, Saint Death. In the shadows of Mexican Catholicism, Santa Muerte is a controversial figure. She is the bony lady, the skinny one, a skeletal figure draped in robes, holding a scythe and a globe. She is the saint of the dispossessed, the criminals, the outcasts, and those who live on the razor's edge of mortality. The Catholic Church condemns her, but for Juana, she was a patron, a protector, a mirror. Juana, the Lady of Silence, felt a kinship with the Lady of the Bony Face. Both were powerful, both were feared, and both presided over the transition from life to nothingness. Juana believed that by taking these religious items, the very crosses and saints the victims had prayed to for protection, she was stripping them of their spiritual power and transferring it to herself. It was a metaphysical conquest. Your God could not save you, she seemed to be saying as she pocketed a rosary. Now your prayers belong to me. Inside her own home, a cramped apartment she shared with her family, Juana kept a shrine. It was a terrifying altar to her dual life. Amidst the mundane clutter of poverty, there was a space dedicated to the skeleton saint. There, she would place the stolen tokens. A dead woman's religious calendar might sit next to a candle burning in gratitude for Juana's own safety. A ceramic angel taken from a murder scene might be placed at the feet of the Santa Muerte statue. It was a grotesque ecosystem of faith and murder. Juana would stand before this altar, perhaps still smelling of the old lady's perfume or the metallic tang of adrenaline, and she would pray. She didn't pray for forgiveness. She prayed for invisibility. She prayed for strength. She offered the souvenirs as tribute, believing that the saint of death was pleased with her work. Look, my skinny lady, she might have whispered, I have sent another one to you. Keep the police away. Keep me hidden. This ritual explained why the police were so baffled. They couldn't build a profile on a thief who stole worthless trinkets. It didn't fit the logic of greed. It fit the logic of madness. To Juana, the apartment wasn't just a crime scene. It was a harvest. She was harvesting souls for the grave and tokens for her altar. The pantyhose she used to strangle them was the tool, but the little ceramic dog she put in her pocket was the prize. She would leave the apartment, locking the door behind her if she had the keys, effectively sealing the tomb. She would walk out into the bright Mexico City sun, clutching her bag of stolen memories, and merge into the crowd. She would go home, cook dinner for her children, and perhaps later, light a candle at her shrine, the flickering flame illuminating the stolen crucifix of a woman who was, at that very moment, lying cold and alone on her living room floor, waiting to be found. The year 2005 broke over Mexico City not with hope, but with a suffocating blanket of dread. The Matavillégidas was no longer just a rumor in the back alleys. It was a headline screaming from every newsstand, a phantom haunting every conversation. The body count was rising with a terrifying rhythm, and the police were drowning in their own incompetence. The city demanded answers, the mayor demanded arrests, and the families of the victims demanded justice. The pressure was a physical weight, pressing down on the shoulders of the detectives until they were desperate enough to try anything. In a last-ditch effort to catch the ghost, the authorities launched a massive, sprawling dragnet known as Operation Park. The logic was sound, even if the profile remained fatally flawed. They knew the killer hunted the elderly. They knew the elderly congregated in the city's parks, places of refuge like Alameda Central or the lush, green spaces of Chapultepec, to feed pigeons, soak up the sun, and talk about the old days. So, the police flooded these zones. Hundreds of undercover officers were deployed. They sat on benches, hiding behind newspapers with holes cut for their eyes like characters in a bad noir film. They dressed as street sweepers, as vendors selling elotes, as lovers entangled on the grass. They watched the grandmothers. They watched the lonely women walking with canes. And most importantly, they watched for the man in the dress. They scanned the crowds for broad shoulders, for Adam's apples, for wigs that didn't sit right. They were hunting a caricature, a monster from a movie, waiting for a hulking figure to drag a grandmother into the bushes. And through this sea of paranoia, Juana Barraza swam like a shark. In open water, completely unnoticed. She didn't avoid the parks, she thrived in them. She walked right past the undercover agents, her sturdy frame moving with the confident, heavy gait of a woman who belongs. She wore her sensible skirts, her cheap blouses, her hair cut short and practical. She didn't look like a killer. She looked like a vecina, a neighbor. She looked like the woman who sells you tacos or the woman who cleans your office. She was the camouflage itself. There were moments of heart-stopping proximity. Juana would sit on a bench, perhaps catching her breath after a visit to a victim, and an undercover cop would be sitting 10 feet away, scanning the horizon for a suspicious male. She might have even nodded to them, a polite, weary acknowledgement between two working-class people in a hot, dusty city. The arrogance of it was breathtaking. She was drinking a soda, the adrenaline of murder still humming in her veins, while the entire machinery of the state looked right through her. The sketch artist composites released to the public were almost comical in their inaccuracy. They showed a square-jawed, masculine face, sometimes with heavy stubble, sometimes with a wig. Juana must have seen these posters plastered on telephone poles. She must have looked into the face of the monster they were hunting and felt a surge of dark, intoxicating power. They don't know me, she would think. They will never know me because they don't see me. But even as she walked with impunity, the net was undeniably tightening. The sheer volume of the crimes was creating a statistical trap. You can only roll the dice so many times before they come up snake eyes. The police were getting closer to the pattern, if not the person. They began to realize the killer was posing as a nurse or social worker. They started warning the public. Do not open your door to anyone offering free aid. The grandmothers were terrified. The doors were being bolted tighter. The easy targets were vanishing. Juana was finding it harder to gain entry. The social worker, ruse was losing its potency as fear inoculated the community. This frustration began to make her reckless. The kills became more frequent, more desperate. She was no longer just satisfying a compulsion. She was racing against the inevitable. By late 2005, the city was a powder keg. The police were humiliated, the public was in a panic, and the little old lady killer was still out there, a shadow in the sunlight. Juana Barraza was walking a tightrope over an abyss, and the wind was picking up. She had fooled an entire country, evaded the largest manhunt in Mexico City's history, and turned the police force into a laughingstock. But every predator eventually makes a mistake. Every streak of luck runs out. And for the Lady of Silence, the clock was ticking down to zero. The sun rose on January 25, 2006, casting long, sharp shadows over the Moctezuma neighborhood. It was a day like any other in the sprawling chaos of the capital, but for Juana Barraza, it was the day the music would finally stop. She was 48 years old now. Her hair cropped short and dyed a reddish hue, her body heavy but still possessing that wrestler's density. She walked the streets with the confidence of a predator who had forgotten what it felt like to be prey. She had killed so many times, walked away from so many corpses, that she had begun to believe in her own invincibility. She believed the bony lady was shielding her from the eyes of the law. She spotted her target, a house on Calle Jose J. Jasso. Inside lived Ana Maria de los Reyes Alfaro, an 82-year-old woman, frail and trusting. Juana approached the door, her script ready. She wasn't just Juana today. She was the benevolent face of the state, a helper here to offer assistance to the elderly. Ana Maria, perhaps lonely, perhaps just polite, made the fatal error that dozens had made before her. She unlocked the door. She let the devil in. Once inside, the familiar, dark rhythm took over. The conversation, the glass of water, the false sense of security. But this time, Juana was impatient. The pressure of the manhunt, the tightness of the city's nerves, perhaps it made her hasty. She didn't wait long. She saw the stethoscope lying on the table, a cruel irony, a medical instrument meant to listen to life, and she snatched it up. In a blur of violence, she was behind Ana Maria, the rubber tubing wrapped around the old woman's neck. Juana pulled. The wrestler's muscles bunched, the strength of La Dama del Silencio flooding her arms. It was quick, brutal, and silent. Ana Maria slumped forward, her life extinguished in seconds. Juana stood over her, breathing hard, the rush of the kill washing over her. She began her looting, grabbing a few trinkets, moving with the arrogance of someone who owns the time. But she had made a critical miscalculation, a fatal oversight. Ana Maria was not as alone as the others. Just as Juana was preparing to leave, clutching her bag of stolen souvenirs, the front door opened. It wasn't the police. It wasn't a neighbor. It was a young man, a tenant who rented a room in Ana Maria's house. He had come home early. He walked into the living room and his world shattered. He saw his landlady, the woman who was like a grandmother to him, lying lifeless on the floor, the stethoscope still pulled tight around her neck. And standing there, frozen for a split second like a deer in headlights, was a sturdy woman in red. The silence broke. The young man didn't freeze in fear. He exploded in rage. "What did you do?" he screamed. Juana, the mask of the social worker slipping for the first time, turned and ran. She burst out the front door, her heavy legs pumping, hitting the pavement of the Mexico City street. But the young man was faster. He chased her, screaming for help, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "Catch her. She killed her. Catch her." It was a scene of pure chaos. A middle-aged woman sprinting down the sidewalk, a desperate young man on her heels, shouting bloody murder. As fate, or perhaps the bony lady's twisted sense of humor would have it, a patrol car was nearby. The officers, who had spent months looking for a man in a dress in the parks, looked up to see this bizarre chase unfolding right in front of them. They saw the woman running. They saw the panic in her eyes. They didn't see a Mataviejida's suspect. They just saw a fleeing criminal. They gunned the engine and cut her off. Juana stopped, her chest heaving, trapped between the police car and the enraged tenant. The officers stepped out, guns drawn, shouting for her to get down. The wrestler, the killer, the phantom who had haunted Mexico City for almost a decade, raised her hands. There was no mask to hide behind now, no ring ropes to duck through. As they handcuffed her, she didn't look like a monster. She looked like a tired, heavy-set woman who had just missed the bus. But in her bag, they found the stethoscope. They found the trophies. And as they looked at her face, really looked at it for the first time, the pieces of the puzzle slammed together with a deafening click. The broad shoulders, the short hair, the strength. The radio crackled. "We have a suspect in custody." They didn't know yet that they hadn't just caught a murderer. They had caught the murderer. The Lady of Silence had finally been made to speak. The interrogation room was a sterile box of white walls and humming fluorescent lights, a place where time seemed to suspend itself. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and the electric tension of a mystery finally unraveling. Across the metal table sat Juana Barraza. She was not the hulking transvestite the police had spent years hunting. She was a mother. She was a vendor who sold popcorn. She was a wrestler whose glory days were behind her. And she was the most prolific serial killer in the history of Mexico. When the detectives finally connected the dots, the realization hit them like a physical blow. The fingerprints, the physical description, the history, it all aligned. They discovered her alter ego, La Dama del Silencio. They looked at photos of her in the ring, wearing her mask, lifting opponents with ease, and suddenly the impossible strength of the killer made terrifying sense. The Matavilladas didn't need to be a man to strangle a human being. She just needed to be a luchadora. Juana didn't cower. She didn't weep or beg for forgiveness. When the evidence was laid out, the stethoscope, the eyewitness identification by the tenant, the fingerprints at the scene, her defiance began to crack, revealing the molten core of rage beneath. She confessed, but it was her reason that chilled the detectives to the bone. They expected a tale of robbery gone wrong, or perhaps a delusion of hearing voices. Instead, they got the raw, bleeding truth of a traumatized child. "I hate ladies," she told them, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. "I hate them because my mother mistreated me, beat me, and always cursed at me." There it was. The ghost of Justice Samperio, the mother who had traded her daughter for 3 beers, had been present at every single murder. Juana wasn't killing random strangers. She was killing her mother, over and over again, 40 times over. Each strangulation was an act of revenge against the woman who had failed to protect her, the woman who had sold her innocence for alcohol. The little old ladies were merely proxies for the one old lady she couldn't erase from her mind. The trial was a media circus. Mexico was glued to the television screens. The Matavilladas was paraded in front of the cameras, sometimes smiling, sometimes looking bored, often behind the bars of a holding cell that looked remarkably like the wrestling cages she once knew. She was charged with 16 murders and 12 robberies, though the police and experts believe the true count was closer to 48 victims. The prosecution painted a picture of a cold, calculating predator who used the trust of the elderly as a weapon. In 2008, the judge delivered the final verdict, a sentence meant to bury the legend forever. Juana Barraza was sentenced to 759 years in prison. 759 years. It was a number that defied comprehension, a symbolic weight meant to ensure that the Lady of Silence would never again walk the streets of Mexico City. But even in prison, Juana refused to fade into obscurity. She became a queen of the Santa Marta Acatitla prison. She took on a new role, not as a killer, but as a vendor again, selling tacos and snacks to other inmates on Tuesdays and Thursdays. In a bizarre twist that only true crime can offer, she even found love behind bars, marrying another inmate in a collective wedding, though the union was short-lived. She remained a fighter, a Ruda, navigating the violence of prison with the same toughness she had learned in the ring. Today, the streets of Mexico City are safer for the abuelitas, but the scar remains. Juana Barraza destroyed more than just lives. She destroyed trust. She turned the knock on the door from a sound of welcome into a sound of dread. She took the figure of the nurse, the helper, the social worker, and twisted it into a figure of death. The story of the old lady killer is not just a story of murder. It is a tragedy of cycles. The cycle of abuse that began with a bottle of beer and a mother's betrayal ended with 759 years of silence. The wrestler finally lost her match, but she made sure the whole world would remember her name.